Okay.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So I wrote at the top of the page the wrestling match, and that's definitely where we're going to start our discussion this week. And we're going to talk about the famous conflict, what exactly it was. We'll see a couple of different opinions in a minute, but we're going to move from there to the denouement, the conclusion of that scene, which of course is where the protagonist, right? The other guy, I'm going to say the Malach, but we'll see that that's its own argument. Actually gives Yaakov his new name Yisrael, and it gets confirmed by Hashem later in the Parsha. So the first part is we'll talk about the wrestling match, and then the struggle, however you want to call it. And then the second half, we'll talk about the two names, Yaakov and Yisrael. But let's just begin with the verses about the wrestling match. Okay, the Yavater Yaakov Levado, and Yaakov was left alone. We'll see a couple of opinions over what happened that he found himself all alone. We'll see a couple of opinions about that. And then it says, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So again, we'll see a number of opinions over who this unnamed stranger is. But even though it's not in any of the commentaries we're going to look at, there is a more modern opinion that the only person you can struggle with or wrestle with when you're all alone is yourself. And we do have to entertain the possibility that Ya'akov Avinu was, to a certain extent, debating with himself. He spends a lot of his life afraid that he is, unlike Avraham and Yitzchak, he's under threat most of his life. And so the struggling with himself may have to do with the fact that he is afraid. I just want to remind you, the fact that Ya'akov Avinu is afraid is reflected in the fact that at least 3 times God tells Yaakov, don't be afraid. And there's a famous song that many people sing on Motzei Shabbat, on Saturday night, that, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov, don't be afraid, my servant Jacob, because Yaakov did spend a lot of his time afraid. But we'll come back to that idea a little bit later. But first, let's do the famous Rashi, who gives 3 opinions about this wrestling match, this struggle. And he starts off with Menachem ben Saruk, who was a grammarian, was very, very big on dikduk. And he says that the term avek comes from the word avak, which means dust. So when you take the word for dust and make it into a verb, it means get dusty. A man covered himself with dust. I used to spend a lot of my life dusty, it seemed. Taking the verb is connected in a sense with dust. It would mean that they were raising the dust with their feet through their movements. Okay, so in other words, the struggle could be seen by the dust rising up. Okay. However, so now Rashi says he disagrees. However, am of the opinion that it means he fastened himself on, and that is an Aramaic word. He says the word la'abek means to connect. So in other words, they were, grappling with each other, and holding tightly to each other, trying to throw the other guy. Okay? And they joined in this fight. And he twined fringes with loops. So in other words, they were like entwined with each other. It denotes intertwining, for such as the movement of 2 people making strong efforts to throw each other. Okay, and then he brings the famous opinion that who was this stranger? It is Esav's guardian angel Malach. Okay, So Rashi makes three different comments. Before we go on, I just want to tell you one very, very fast story. The first time I ever met Rav Moshe Feinstein, Baruch Hashem, I had a couple of opportunities to meet with him. But when I was a freshman in college, I had a friend of mine who was about tshuva, as I was at the time, and he had been a wrestling champion in Connecticut. And the YU wrestling team wanted him to wrestle on the team, and he didn't want to because he came to YU, and I understood he came to YU to learn. He wasn't interested in going out for extracurricular activities. But the wrestling team was very excited that they would, finally have a good wrestler on the team. So they said to him, look, if you join the wrestling team, everybody else on the team, with another dozen guys or so, would learn in the base medrash every night for an hour. So he had to think about it. Oh my God, I can be, mizakeh the rabbim, but So he found out that Rav Moshe Feinstein was going to be near YU at this shul in the South Bronx on a Motzei Shabbos to speak at a Malav Malka. It's a long story, why he went to this terrible neighborhood in the late 60s. It was really like really like gang warfare area, and it looked like a bomb. But anyways, so we went, and after Reb Moshe spoke, I think the reason he asked me to go with him was I think I was the only other guy he knew at YU that had a hat. And he didn't want to go to Reb Moshe without a guy with a hat. So anyways, I went with him, and afterwards he took these photographs out of him as the wrestling champion in high school in some, I don't remember what town in Connecticut. And Reb Moshe's looking at these, and Reb Moshe's saying, maybe it's exercise, And he's speaking a little bit in Hebrew, a little bit in Yiddish, a little bit in English. And finally, when it's all over, and he takes and Reb Moshe took the photographs and made them very neat himself, and he puts them back in the envelope. We were going to do it, but and then he looks up at my friend Avram, and he says, but tell me, do people really do this? So I felt, I'm standing there, and I'm trying not to laugh, and I felt like saying, it's like Yaakov and the Malach, but I didn't say anything. I was too nervous to say anything. But it was very funny. The Reb Moshe said, people really do this, because it looks very funny, because the way collegiate wrestling is done is you really are intertwined with one another, just like Rashi says. But okay, be that as it may. So those are two pshatim for what they were doing, and why the word that they use is not to fight or make a milchama. It's instead avek, to either intertwine themselves or to raise dust. The Ramban, on the other hand, brings up another problem and says Jacob was left all alone. What's that mean? That is, for he had forgotten some small jars. Now, Rashi mentions this also, but since I had it here in the Ramban, I didn't give it in Rashi. So he went back because he didn't want to leave any of the family's possessions behind, even these small, I'm going to assume, kli cheres, these small clay vessels. And then he says he returned for them. These are the words of Rashi. I didn't put the Rashi, but he quotes Rashi. But I think, now as the Ramban gives his own opinion, but in line with the plain meaning of the scripture, the verse means that he made his family pass together with him by commanding others to do it. He returned to the camp after ferrying his family across, and he commanded all the others to pass over the brook before him, and so he remained behind them. So the Ramban feels he was all alone to make sure that everybody else had safely crossed the stream, the Yabok. The Yabok, which we know where it is. It's one of those seasonal rivers that flows into the Jordan, in the Jordan Valley. And at this point, when he's coming into Eretz Yisrael, must have been springtime, I assume, because apparently there was water in it. And so he was last and alone because he made sure that everyone had successfully crossed the stream. Okay, the Sforno takes this situation and he wants to put it into a larger perspective. By the way, we're going to do another Sforno in a few minutes about the name. I was thinking about putting them together, but I just wanted to keep the different parts of the presentation separate. And he makes an important point. Salvation, geula, occurs at the end of a period of ups and downs. That some people have this feeling that Jewish history should be happier, more upbeat. But that's not what the Sforno's saying. The Sforno's saying that to get to geula requires difficulties, so that Ya'akov Avinu goes through all of the machinations that leads to a geula situation, and he has all of these ups and downs. And we see it more in his life than in the life of Avraham and Yitzchak. Avraham, although he has a couple of difficult situations, but Avraham's always like in control of the situation. And things didn't seem to bother Yitzchak Avinu very much. But Yaakov really spends a lot of time in trouble. And this idea of ups and downs is very important, and we'll come back to it. We'll come back to this idea. And though Yaakov / Yisrael suffered many reverses in his struggle with Esav, their relationship really is, a very, very fraught relationship. And he, in parenthesis, in the historical global struggle between the two philosophies. In other words, Yaakov has a very spiritual philosophy of life, and Esav has a very physical. It's all about how much land you have and how much money you have and how many sheep you have. It's all about the physical stuff. Totally different ideas of what it means to be successful in Olam Hazeh. In the end, Yaakov triumphs. The blessing given by the angel here to Yaakov at the end of the struggle at daybreak symbolizes this idea as a synopsis of Jewish history, which is you are going to struggle. And this scene, as well as others, but this one perhaps more than any other, it gives Chazal that idea that night represents the galut and the difficulties, and dawn, when the angel can't fight with him anymore, represents the geula. And of course, we know that the custom historically is that you should daven shacharit at dawn, that you should say the bracha, Baruch Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you Hashem, who has redeemed Israel, with the sun really budding over the horizon, and then you say Shemona Esrei. Because dawn represents geula, and night represents galut and difficulties. Okay. And now Rabbeinu Bechaye. We're slightly out of chronological order. The Sforno was after Rabbeinu Bechaye, but I put this comment afterwards. It is well known that had it not been for the original sin in Gan Eden. Now, I don't know what he means by it's well known. I don't know how many people know this, but I mean, I guess he means in Kabbalistic scholars, because Rabbeinu Bechaye was a student of Kabbalah, that if it hadn't been for the Chet, the original sin of Gan Eden, which was eating from Eitz Hadat, the tree of knowledge of good and bad, there would not be a noticeable difference between humans, man, and angels, malach. Interesting idea. So in other words, the fact that humans are different, what is the big difference that we believe took place to humanity with the sin? Mortality. Many, many commentaries believe that if Adam Arishon, Adam and Chava, hadn't sinned, that humanity would not have only have stayed in the Garden of Eden, but that we would have been immortal. and that would have made us much more like these spiritual beings, the angels. Now, there are other things. We talk about that there was some sort of zuhama, there's some sort of spiritual pollution that entered humanity. We say a lot of things, but the big thing is that we became mortal. And he says another big thing is that we would have been more angelic. On the contrary, man would outrank the angel in every respect. We base this idea on a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The righteous are greater than the angels. So those people, the tzaddikim and olam hazeh, who can overcome the zuhama, the bad stuff that happened to us because of the original sin, the chet of Adam and Chava, those people somehow are greater than angels. I always understood this Gemara differently. I understood this Gemara to mean greater than angels because, unlike angels, we have a Yetzer Hara. And when we have this evil inclination. And when we do the right thing, it's really very cool. As opposed to when the angels do the right thing, they've got no choice. They have to do the right thing. So that's what I always thought that this Gemara meant, because a human, a tzaddik, but a human who does the right thing overcame the Yetzer Hara. That's why it's considered greater. But his point here is totally different. He meant really objectively, humanity without the sin of the Garden of Eden would have been better than angels. Okay, accordingly, the angel came to try and find a sin Yaakov was guilty. In other words, the struggle with Yaakov is specifically looking for a chink in his armor. And the chink in the armor of a tzaddik is, chalila, a sin. So that's what he's really like, feeling him out and searching for the sin. Okay. Him trying to find the sin Yaakov is guilty of in order to use the sin as a weapon to overpower him. However, he couldn't succeed. The only sin he could find was that Yaakov had married two sisters while they were both alive. Something which had not yet been forbidden, but we do believe that the Avot tried to keep the Torah even before Ma'amad HaSinai, even before the Epiphany at Sinai when the Torah was revealed. Now, last year we talked about the death of Rachel, and one of the reasons given for her death was that the Ramban believes that the Avot, the patriarchs, only kept Torah in Eretz Yisrael. So in Haran, in the house of Lavan, outside of Eretz Yisrael, it was mutar, is permitted for Yaakov to be married to two sisters. But when they come back into the heartland of Eretz Yisrael, to Beit El, at that point, it becomes a sin again. And there are commentaries that believe that that's why Rachel had to pass on, so that Yaakov wouldn't be married to two sisters. Okay, I don't know. We're not getting into that. That's aside. Okay. Had married two sisters like that. The Torah alludes to this when writing he inflicted an injury on Yaakov's hip joint. Hip joint meaning having to do with his sexual organ. This was a euphemism for his sexual organs and the seat of sexual desires. In other words, the one sin they could find, sin in quotation marks, the one negative thing had to do with his marital life. So for punishment such as it was administered near that organ so that Yaakov limped for a while. Now it says in a few verses after the encounter with Esau that Yaakov emerged shalem, complete. So we believe, most commentaries believe, that by then the limp was eliminated. He'd recovered. Other people believe that the shalem there is spiritual and that Yaakov limped, if not his whole life, for a long part of his life. And we don't know the resolution to that argument. We have no evidence. We know he was limping immediately after the scene, but it's a big debate amongst commentaries how long Yaakov continued to limp, how long the residual totzaot, repercussions of that encounter stayed with Yaakov. And the truth is, we don't know. The truth is, we don't know, but most commentaries believe that the limp and the repercussions only stayed with him until he departs from Esav. That once Esav goes his way and we go our way, Yaakov and the Shvatim go the other direction, at that point, he is fully recovered from this encounter. Take your pick, it's up to you. Okay, so we've got the struggle. So the question is, what comes out of the struggle is the malach, the angel, now tells Yaakov, wow, you're pretty special. You're not going to be called Yaakov anymore. You're going to now be called Yisrael. And so that's where we're going to head for most of the time that we have left. And the Sforno has a comment on that as well. Now, before we even get in, I just want to make you aware of the question that bothers a lot, if not all, of the commentaries. We know that other names have been changed. In other words, Avram's name was changed, Sarah's name was changed. And the situation with those names being changed was that we never hear the original name again. Once Avram becomes Abraham, the name Avram is never used again. The same thing with Sarai and Sarah. So a lot of the commentaries are perplexed by that reality that Yaakov's name, Yaakov, continues to be used. And so in the commentary of what the names mean, we're going to continually see references to that problem. How come the name Yaakov continued to be used, even though when Hashem confirms the name later in the Parsha, right after the death of Rachel, he says, your name will no longer be Yaakov. And then Hashem himself uses the name Yaakov. So there is a confusion there. Okay, so the Sforno starts us off. Your name will no longer be Yaakov, a reference to the end of days. In other words, according to the Sforno, when the malach or the opponent says to him, you will not be called Yaakov, that doesn't mean now. That means at the time of the Geula Shlema, the final massive redemption at the end of time, at the time of the coming of Mashiach. So then the name Yaakov won't be used anymore. That's how he gets out of the problem. Okay. When Israel will have survived the destruction of all the Gentile nations, destruction of Gentile nations, yes, but not all of the Gentiles. We know from Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, that many Gentiles, righteous Gentiles, will survive the tremendous uproar of the final redemption, and they themselves will become observers of Torah, if not full Jews. When that time comes, no one will ever again use the name Yaakov. For the Jewish people and the stigma that used to be associated with that name, and that's a comment that was put in this translation, okay? The very word Yaakov already contained within this message that the bearer of this name will triumph at the end. So the name Akev means not only heel or bottom of the foot, it can also mean in the aftermath of something, like in the footprints that were left behind. So it means the name itself has this message, the mirror of this name, and triumph at the end. Once he has triumphed, there is no more need or point in having to use that name anymore, which alludes to something which will be realized only in the future. The future will then have arrived, and only the name Yisrael, which is a name that seems to mean a victor, we'll talk more about that in a minute, that name will be the only name that will be used for Bnei Yisrael, and as a reference to Yaakov, who we believe will in some way participate in this final Geula. Okay, so that's the Sforno. The Radak, Reb David Kimchi, talking about the same issue, it goes in a different direction. The meaning is not only Yaakov will your name be in the future. So he's saying, no, never meant that the name Yaakov will disappear. Never meant that. There's no reason for people to have thought that that was going to be true. The Radak says it means that you have the name Yaakov, but it won't be your only name. So don't translate it the way, that simple way. Your name won't be. Your name will not only be Yaakov anymore. Knowing that the meaning of our verse is that Yaakov will henceforth not only be known as Yaakov, helps explain the many occasions later when this original name is applied to him. Actually, the name Yaakov appears in Breshit more times than the name Yisrael. So that really the name Yaakov does continue. That's only true of Breshit. The rest of Torah, Yisrael is more common. As distinct from the name change of Avram to Avram, and of course from Sarai to Sarah. The name Yisrael denotes the nation founded by Yaakov. This, I think, is beautiful. The Radak is making a point that basically no one else makes as powerfully. The name Yisrael is an outgrowth of a development in Yaakov that was based upon the name Yaakov. So he's Yaakov moving toward Yisrael all the time. Our sages are of two minds. If the former name or the additional name is the principal name. So there's an argument in the Gemara. This is going to come up when we get to Rabbi Lichtenstein in just, I'm going to say, in about 15 minutes. Which name is principal? Now, it does seem like it's hard to debate the fact that in Sefer Bereshis, Yaakov seems to remain the principal name, but in later texts, Yisrael seems to be more common. But there is a machloket, an argument within the Gemara. Which name is more significant? And I'll put it in perspective in a minute. Rabbi Zechariah of the opinion that the name Yaakov remained the principal name, whereas the majority opinion is that from this point on, the name Yisrael became the principal name of Yaakov. Let's assume for a minute that Yisrael is the final product. And Yaakov is the name which is the means by which he becomes this newer, more powerful model called Yisrael. So what's more important? Is the final product more important? Or is the pathway, is the means to get there more important? And that seems to be the argument. Is the fact that he's going to become this powerful being, hero called Yisrael important? Or is what's important is he only got to that level, that madrega that we call Yisrael, through the means of spending a lot of his life being Yaakov, being someone who struggles. I like saying that it's the means that got him there that ultimately is most important. I think that that's a very powerful and beautiful idea, that we shouldn't forget the struggles we go through to become the final product that we want to be. And it's an interesting argument. And I think, a lot can be said philosophically for either side. But as a teacher, I like the idea of, that what's most important is the struggle that you go through to become that final product. What's more important ultimately? Is it the butterfly or is it the caterpillar that spent all that time, munching away so that the animal could exist later as a beautiful butterfly? People much more appreciate butterflies. People don't say ichsa when they see a butterfly, but they do when they see a caterpillar. There's something to be said for each position, and to a certain extent, Yaakov is the caterpillar, and Yisrael is the butterfly. Okay. And now some more recent opinions that are talking about the names. Okay, so we're going to do Rabbi Sachs first. Rabbi Sachs, Olav Shalom, was very much concerned with this issue. He wrote a number of essays about the name change. And in one of them, he said the following: it was Jacob's inner battle with existential truth. Now, here's a problem. We don't, in regular modern English, we don't use the word existential the way it originally meant. Today, we use the word existential to mean the struggle to exist. But originally, as we'll say, God forbid, the struggle between the Ukraine and Russia is an existential one for the Ukraine, because if they lose, they won't exist anymore. Okay, but that's not how the term was originally used by the philosophers Immanuel Kant and Kierkegaard. Originally, it meant, how do they develop their ideas of the importance of existence? It's not whether or not they exist. So here the word is being used in its more philosophic sense. Rabbi Sachs, Olav Shalom, was a philosophy major at university. So as James in a battle with existential truth, what is truly important in life? Who was he? The man who longed to be Esav. Remember, the name Yaakov comes from the footprint. So in other words, he was holding on to the heel. He wanted to usurp the role of Esav. And that's the Yaakov in him. The Yaakov in him is jealous of Esav. Or the man called to a different destiny, the road less traveled. So how nice of Rabbi Sachs to quote from an American poet. Okay, the Abrahamic covenant. In other words, the name Jacob signified and signifies struggle. The name Israel also signified struggle, but the terms of the conflict have been reversed. It is as if the man said to him in the past, you struggled to be Esav. He was jealous of Esav. He wanted to be Esav. Esav was, the hero in the community, and he was the 97-pound weakling. So he struggled. He wanted to be Esav. In the future, you'll struggle not to be Esav, but to be yourself. And this is one of the most important struggles everybody has in life, trying to decide who they really are. And Yisrael is the name that means you discovered who you really are, which is not a hunter warrior. It's a patriarch. It's a spiritual leader. In the future, in the past, you held on to Esav's heel. In the future, you will hold on to God. It's so amazing. Think about the birth and the ladder. At the birth, He's grabbing onto the lowest possible extremity of his big brother. And later, he has the dream, and he's not interested in the bottom. He's interested in the top. What a difference. What a reversal of his, of his aspirations, so to speak. In the future, you will hold on to God. You will not let go of him, capital H. He will not let go of you. Now let go of Esav. Give up being Yaakov so that you can be free to hold on to God and be Yisrael. The passage ends with the word V'yavo Yaakov Shalem. And Yaakov ends the encounter with Esav Shalem. Now, I mentioned that verse a couple of minutes ago, meaning that perhaps he didn't limp anymore. Okay? But Rav Sachs is taking that phrase more metaphorically. It's not that he's physically whole, he's spiritually whole. And Jacob emerged complete. That is the stunning truth at which Jacob finally arrived, and to which the name Yisrael is testimony. To be complete, we do not need Esav's blessings of wealth and power. Yaakov steals a blessing 2 weeks ago. The blessing he steals is the blessing of wealth and power. The blessing of Avraham, the blessing of being a patriarch, of being part of the shalshelet of the eternal chain of tradition, that was given to him by both his father and mother, both Yitzchak and Rivka, before he left for Padan Aram. He wanted, or his mother wanted him to have both blessings. Yitzchak always wanted him to get the spiritual blessing of Abraham. It was the blessing of wealth and power, which Esav wanted, and Rivka wanted for Yaakov as well. As to be complete, we do not need Esav's blessings of wealth and power. As is another face. I would have said fate. As is another fate, an alternative destiny, a different blessing. The face we bear is the image we see reflected in the face of God when we wrestle with him and refuse to let go. So in other words, the two different names represent, according to Rav Sachs, two different sets of aspirations. His original set and his eventual true goals and aspirations in life. So that whenever, from now till the end of the book of Breshit, we call him Yaakov, that means that he's in the midst of struggles that are based on more physical blessings. When we use the name Yisrael, it's when he is struggling in the world of tzidkut, of righteousness, of spirituality. So both names have their appropriate usages. And I think that that's a very beautiful idea, that when the name Yaakov was used, it's because he wanted to be Esav. When the name Yisrael is used, it's when he has given up that idea and is now much more focused on being a patriarch, on being one of the founders of Yahadut. Okay. We now get to take a look at the Kedushat Levi. Now, the Kedushat Levi is a little bit complicated. Kedushat Levi, of course, is Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and he is one of the giants of the third generation of Hasidic masters, the end of the 1700s and the beginning, first decade of the 1800s. And he's going to look at it from a different point of view. Okay. So Kedushat Levi, again, he's quoting from the Pasuk, which is the quote from the antagonist, right? The bad guy that he struggles with. He said, your name will no longer be Yaakov, but Israel, for you have contended both with celestial forces and with human forces, and you have prevailed. So Yaakov is the name for someone struggling, and we saw that in Rav Sachs. And Yisrael is the name for somebody who has succeeded, is no longer struggling. He's already won the war. Okay. There are people who constantly remain attached to God, even when they are engaged in conversation with human beings. I don't know, who, many of you have encountered in your lives, but there are people that sometimes you're talking to them and you get this impression that there's something else going on besides your conversation with them. Some people like very, very spiritually connected. And sometimes, in their conversation with you, they'll make, comments that clearly display a sensitivity to things that are beyond, what you might have been talking about. And there are such special spiritually connected people. Okay. There are other people who, while engaged in a conscious effort to serve the Lord, concentrate on this to the exclusion of everything else. However, we know, and we try to do this when we daven. When we daven, we try to, almost put on blinders, and focus. Can I really, get rid of all of my worldly concerns and just talk to Hashem? Just let HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just let Hashem know what's on my mind. Can I do that? Okay. These people, while engaged in mundane activities such as business conversations with their peers, cannot at the same time remain conscious of their duties towards their Creator. So there are some people that even when doing mundane things seem and are spiritually connected. And there are other people that just can't keep that dual focus going on, and they have to concentrate on one to the exclusion of the other. It's one or the other. Okay? So now listen to what the Kedushas Levi says. The first type of person deserves the title Yisrael. Yisrael and Yaakov both struggle. However, when Yisrael struggles, it's always with the spiritual component uppermost in his mind. With Yaakov, it's one or the other. He can't focus on both at the same time. As the letter Yashar, upright, as well as the letters Rosh, head, are part of that title. In other words, that no matter what Yisrael is doing, his head is in heaven. He may be doing something else with his hands and his feet, but his head is always in heaven. His head is always directed, Yashar, upright, to the spiritual. And that's very beautiful and relatively rare that we find such people. And there are stories about the Chavetz Chaim who would spend a couple of hours for most of his life as working as a storekeeper before he went to the Beit Midrash to study. And he was able to always not only keep track of the prices of all of the products in his dry goods store, but he was also able to simultaneously be concerned with spiritual things. There are such people, even though they are indeed rare, and that's Yisrael. I guess that's why his name was Yisrael Meir Kagan HaKohen, right? Okay. The secondary category of person is an observant Jew, a good person, is called Yaakov. That is Yud Akev, meaning that his attachment to God is Akev, secondary when he's doing other things. just as a heel is a secondary and not a primary organ. Now, I agree with the Kedushas Levi, but I think even the Yaakov personality, when davening or when in shul, can keep the spiritual in the forefront. I think that their issue is they can only do one at a time, and it's not, he makes it sound a little bit more negative. I think the second type of individual is much more common, that they can only live in one world at a time, as opposed to the Israel type, which I think is quite uncommon, who can really, bridge the gap all the time. No matter what they're doing, spirituality informs their behavior. Okay. The last comment on the page is from Rabbi Lichtenstein, Alav Shalom, who was, of course, the Rosh Yeshiva, the son-in-law of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but of course the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush, and was not only a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but a very critical thinker. He actually had a degree in English literature. So he really thought through the literary meaning of many things in a very, very sophisticated way. So let's take a look and see. Thus, the change in Abraham's name had religious significance. So long as Abraham was the father of Aram, Aram the Harayim, which is Ur, where he originally came from, okay? One could be led to think that God, of whom Abraham was the earthly representative, ruled only over Aram. So in other words, when he was Avram and he was trying to convert people to ethical monotheism, they thought that this God was the only God, but they didn't necessarily believe that this God had infinite power over everything. Maybe was focused only on Aram, okay, and not over any other countries. When his name was changed to Avraham, father of Av Hamon Goyim, Avraham, it became clear that God ruled the entire world. Thus, Avram's new name, in fact, was intended to express what we consider to be ethical/universal monotheism. And so you couldn't go back to the previous name. The previous name had been superseded by the new context of the new name. The old name no longer had any significance. Okay. However, after the three dots, the change in Yaakov's name has completely different significance. The name Yaakov hints at the simple man who dwells in tents. Now remember, right after he's named Yaakov, he's described. Esav is described as an Ish Sadeh Yodea Sayid, a man of the field who knows how to hunt. And Yaakov is described as an Ish Tam, a simple or innocent man, Yoshev Olim, who dwells in tents. The straightforward student with complete faith, a person inexperienced in life's complications, and someone unlikely to cope in the wide world. In other words, the name Yaakov assumes a certain amount of innocence, a certain amount of naivete, a certain amount of inability to really cope with many of the issues that the world might throw his way. Someone who had no taste of struggle and battle. It's fascinating that he totally gives a new interpretation of the name Yaakov. It's hard to argue with him because in the context of Toldot, what he's saying makes sense. But most people believe that the name Ya'akov, has to do with struggle. But be that as it may, let's stick with Rav Aaron for the time being, even though it is a relatively revolutionary approach. The straightforward student with complete faith, a person inexperienced in life's complications, someone unlikely to cope in the wide world, someone who has had no taste of struggle and battle. The name Yisrael is the complete opposite. For you have, and now he again is literally describing what the antagonist, the Malach, said to him. For you have striven with God and man, and you have prevailed. So in other words, he's no longer the Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. Now, as the name Yaakov doesn't apply to him at this moment when he is a mover and shaker and a defeater of supernatural beings. This is a person who has faced adversity, struggled, and emerged victorious. A person who has learned the intricacies of trickery at the hands of Lavan and nevertheless ended up in a stronger position. He struggled mightily, succeeded, and came out stronger for the experience. A person who has been strengthened by all his trials and tribulations, an experienced man with the power to prevail even over an angel. God, on the other hand, perceives the change in name from another perspective. So as the angel gives him this name because of his ability to be undefeated in their struggle. However, later in the Parsha, when Hashem confirms the name, God, on the other hand, perceives the change in name from another perspective. The name Yaakov is not to be canceled. In other words, if it were, according to Rabbi Lichtenstein, if it were up to the angel, the antagonist in the wrestling match, the name Yaakov would never appear again in Tanakh, just like the name Avram never appears again. Well, although it does appear once in Divrei Yomim just to record the event, but otherwise doesn't appear again. God, on the other hand, perceives the name in another perspective. The name Yaakov is not to be canceled, nor is it to be scorned. Simplicity and studiousness, being an Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim, a simple, innocent person who is studious, living in the tents and the study halls, are of great importance, while power is a secondary characteristic to such a person. Strength, power, and physical survival, Yisrael, are obviously important, but the most important ideals are service, I would say to God, but the translation here says of God, of Torah, and simple faith, or Yaakov. So even though we saw in the Sforno, I take that back, we saw in the Radak that there's an argument over which name is most important, and almost everybody agrees the most important name is Yisrael, except for Reb Zechariah in the Gemara. But Reb Lichtenstein feels that to a certain extent, the name Yaakov is most important. Now, I want to say something about this before we finish. We're running out of time a little bit. That what happens is Reb Lichtenstein, Oliver Shalom, gave this as a sicha to the yeshiva. And I think that the point of Rabbi Lichtenstein was that you guys, right now, learning in the yeshiva, are Yaakov. You are all Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. That's what a yeshiva bacher is. And this right now is what is most important in your life. And he's saying that the Yaakov name is primary for his audience. I don't think that he meant that it's necessarily always primary in life. I believe that people go through different, just like Yaakov himself, Yaakov/Yisrael himself goes through different tikufot. We go through different periods of life. Sometimes we're Yaakov, sometimes we're Yisrael. But Rabbi Lichtenstein, I believe, means that to be a truly successful Yisrael, you've got to go through a period of Yaakov. You need that temporary time of being an innocent, a studious yeshiva bacha student, whether it's in a yeshiva, seminary, doesn't make any difference, that you need that time as well. Yisrael could only be Yisrael because he was an amazing Ya'akov in preparation for being Israel. I think we need both. I think he needed both. And that's why the names go back and forth. And even though Rabbi Aaron is trying to make a case for the Yaakov name is the superior, more important of the two, I think that when we put all of these commentaries together, we have to see our lives as different periods of sometimes Yaakov and sometimes Yisrael. And that we eventually, hopefully, survive through the synthesis of becoming both. That eventually we want to be a Ya'akov Yisrael. It's not that we want to, become one, and because one's better. I think we really want to become the synthesis of the two, and I think that's very important. I think something that every serious Jew should strive for. Okay. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining this evening, and I want to very welcome. And I want to remind everybody that we will be meeting in the restaurant in Ashkelon next week. But for those that won't be there, I'm just I see a couple of people left, so I think okay. I hope we'll send out so they'll hear it. That we will be doing it online as well, and I hope to, when we give out the sources on Sunday, we'll give the exact time when the class will take place. And like this, and we will record it as well. So if it really is inconvenient to hear a class in the neighborhood of 1 p.m., then we will get it onto line. And next week we will be talking about some Hanukkah issues. And I'm assuming that in 2 weeks, we probably won't have a class actually during Hanukkah. So next week will be a preparatory shiur for getting ready for Hanukkah for all of us. Okay, again, thank you all so very much for joining this.
Thank you very much.
And Bez Hashem, see you next week.
Amen.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Finish.